The house felt different when Mark wasn't there. It wasn't just the silence, though that was part of it. It was the way every sound seemed sharper, every shadow longer. Thursday afternoons had always been quiet, but this one felt especially so. The world outside my windows looked gray and sleepy, like someone had pulled a soft blanket over everything. Spring was trying to arrive, but it was taking its sweet time. The sky hung low and pale, the color of old pearls, and tiny droplets of rain kept tapping against the glass like fingers drumming on a table. Each drop seemed to whisper that I was alone, that the house was too big, too quiet, too empty without my husband's familiar presence filling the spaces. Mark had been gone for 2 whole days now. Seattle called, and business trips were part of his job. I knew that when I married him. But knowing something and feeling comfortable with it were 2 different things entirely. The silence always caught me off guard, no matter how many times he traveled. It crept into corners where his laughter usually lived, settled into chairs where he normally sat reading the morning paper. I'd spent the morning trying to keep busy, folded laundry until every towel was perfectly straight, organized the spice rack even though it didn't need organizing, watered plants that were already plenty happy. But by afternoon, I'd run out of small tasks to fill the quiet spaces in my mind. That's when I decided to make tea. Not just any tea, chamomile, the kind that smells like summer afternoons and makes you feel like someone's giving you a warm hug from the inside. I carried the steaming cup to my favorite spot on the living room couch, the corner where the cushions had learned the shape of my body over the years. The couch was old but comfortable, covered in a soft fabric that had faded from deep blue to something gentler. I pulled my favorite throw around my shoulders, a heavy knit blanket that Mark's mother had made for us as a wedding gift. It was the color of cream and felt like being wrapped in a cloud made of wool and love. I had a book with me, one I'd picked up and put down more times than I cared to count. It was a good book, or so everyone said, but my mind kept wandering whenever I tried to read it. Today felt no different. I opened to the page where I'd left off, read the same paragraph twice, then found myself staring out the window instead. The rain was getting heavier now, creating little rivers down the glass and making the world outside look like a watercolor painting that hadn't quite dried yet. I could hear it hitting the roof, a gentle drumming that should have been soothing but somehow made me feel more aware of being alone. I was just settling deeper into my blanket, thinking about maybe making another cup of tea, when the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the quiet house like a stone thrown into still water. I actually jumped a little, my book sliding off my lap and onto the floor with a soft thud. We hardly ever got visitors during the week. The mailman didn't ring the bell and the grocery delivery always came on Tuesdays. Mark wasn't expecting anyone, and neither was I. For a moment, I just sat there, wondering if I'd imagined it. But then it rang again, a polite, patient sound that meant someone was definitely standing on my front porch getting wet in the rain. I set my teacup down carefully on the side table, making sure it was steady, then shuffled across the hardwood floor. My slippers made soft whispering sounds with each step, and I could feel the coolness of the wood even through the thick soles. The house felt bigger somehow when I was moving through it alone, like the rooms had spread out just to remind me of the space Mark usually filled. I tiptoed to the little window beside the front door, the one that let me peek out without being seen. The glass was old and had a slight curve to it that made everything look just a little bit different than it really was. I pressed my face close and looked out, standing on my porch, shifting from one foot to the other and holding what looked like a paper bag, was Paul, Mark's oldest friend from college, the one who'd been in their wedding photos and at every birthday party for the past 15 years. I hadn't seen him in months, maybe longer. Paul was the kind of person who never seemed to change much. His hair was still dark, with just a touch of gray at the temples, and he still had that careful way of standing, like he was always thinking before he moved. He was wearing a dark jacket that looked expensive but not flashy, and even from behind the curved glass, I could see he was getting wet from the rain. This was strange. Paul usually only came around when Mark was home. They'd sit in the kitchen, drinking coffee and talking about work, or they'd watch sports in the living room while I did other things. We were friendly. Of course, he was always polite, always kind, but we didn't really spend time together alone. It just never came up. I realized I'd been staring for too long and quickly moved away from the window. I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror and winced. I looked exactly like someone who'd been having a quiet day at home. My hair was pulled back in a messy bun that was more messy than bun, and I wasn't wearing a speck of makeup. My cardigan was the softest, most comfortable one I owned, which also meant it was the least flattering. It was oversized and a bit worn, the color of oatmeal, and it made me look like I was drowning in wool. But there was nothing to do about it now. Paul was getting wetter by the minute, and it would be rude to leave him standing there while I tried to make myself look more presentable. I opened the door, one hand instinctively reaching up to smooth my hair, though I knew it wouldn't help much. "Paul," I said, and I could hear the surprise in my own voice. "This is unexpected." He smiled, and it was that same gentle, thoughtful smile I remembered. He had always been handsome in a quiet way, not the kind of looks that demanded attention, but the kind that grew on you over time. His eyes were kind, and they crinkled at the corners when he smiled, which made him seem younger than he was. "Hey Helen," he said, and his voice was warm despite the cool air. He held up the paper bag he'd been carrying. "I was in the neighborhood picking something up, and I remembered Mark mentioning that you really liked those almond scones from the bakery over on 5th Street. I thought maybe you'd enjoy some." He paused, looking suddenly uncertain. "I hope this isn't too strange. I probably should have called first." I felt something warm bloom in my chest, surprise, gratitude, maybe something else I couldn't quite name. It had been such a long time since someone had thought of me like that, had remembered something small that I enjoyed and gone out of their way to share it. "That's incredibly thoughtful of you," I said, and I meant it. I reached for the bag, and when our fingers brushed as he handed it over, I noticed his hands were cold from the rain. "But you're getting soaked out there. Come in, please." I stepped aside and gestured him into the house. He hesitated for just a moment, like he was making sure it was really okay, then stepped across the threshold. He shook his jacket off, sending tiny droplets flying, and hung it on the coat hook by the door, the same hook he'd used dozens of times before when he'd come over to see Mark. There was something familiar and comforting about watching him do it, like muscle memory kicking in. He knew where things went in my house, knew the rhythms and routines that came with being a longtime friend. It made me smile despite myself. "Come on," I said, leading him toward the kitchen. "Let me make you some tea. You must be cold." The kitchen was my favorite room in the house, especially on days like this. It faced east, so it got good light in the mornings, and it was painted a warm yellow that made even gray days feel brighter. The rain was hitting the window above the sink, creating patterns that shifted and changed like nature's own art show. Paul took a seat at the small breakfast table, a round wooden piece that Mark and I had found at an antique shop during our second year of marriage. It was just the right size for two people, intimate without being cramped. I'd set flowers there that morning, white daisies in a blue vase, and they brightened the whole space. I busied myself making fresh tea, grateful to have something to do with my hands. I could feel Paul watching me as I moved around the kitchen, but it wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt nice to have someone to take care of, even in such a small way. The scones smelled incredible when I opened the bag, buttery and sweet with just a hint of almond. The bakery on 5th Street was expensive, but they made everything from scratch, and you could taste the difference. I arranged them on a plate, added some butter and jam, and carried everything to the table. "You look well," Paul said softly as I handed him his cup of tea. His fingers wrapped around the ceramic, and I noticed he took a moment to breathe in the steam before taking a sip. I laughed, self-conscious about my appearance. "I look like I've been wrestling with laundry and losing," I said, smoothing down my cardigan. "But thank you for being kind." He chuckled, and the sound was genuinely warm. "You look comfortable," he said. "More relaxed than most people I know, actually." There's something to be said for that. We settled into conversation, and I was surprised by how easy it felt. Usually, when Paul came over, I was busy playing hostess while he and Mark caught up. But now, with just the two of us, I discovered that he was an excellent listener. He asked questions that made me think, shared stories that made me laugh, and somehow made me feel like I was the most interesting person in the room. We talked about work, his job at the architecture firm, my part-time work at the library. We talked about our parents, who were all getting older and needing more care than we'd expected. We talked about books we'd read and places we'd traveled, and how different the world looked now than it had when we were younger. At some point, Paul started telling me about a camping trip he and Mark had taken right after college. They'd driven all the way to the Grand Canyon in Mark's old car, the one that broke down every 100 miles and had no air conditioning. I'd heard Mark tell this story before, but hearing it from Paul's perspective was like discovering a whole new adventure. "Mark didn't tell you about the part where we got completely lost trying to find the campground," Paul said, his eyes lighting up with the memory. We drove around for 3 hours in the dark, and Mark was absolutely convinced that I'd ridden down the wrong directions. But you hadn't, I guessed, grinning. Of course not. But Mark was so stubborn about it that he wouldn't let me look at the map. He kept saying he knew exactly where we were going, right up until we ended up in someone's driveway at midnight. I laughed, picturing a younger Mark being too proud to admit he was lost. It sounded exactly like him. What happened then? The homeowner came out in his bathrobe with a flashlight, and Mark had to explain that we were lost college students looking for a place to camp. The man felt so sorry for us that he let us pitch our tent in his backyard and made us coffee in the morning. That's sweet, I said. Mark never mentioned that part. Mark likes to focus on the adventures and skip over the parts where he needed help, Paul said, but there was no criticism in his voice, just fondness. That's always been his way. There was something in his tone that made me look at him more carefully. Paul had always been the quieter one of the two friends, the one who observed more than he spoke. But today, he seemed more open, more willing to share his thoughts. Maybe it was because Mark wasn't here to dominate the conversation. Or maybe it was just the intimacy of the rainy afternoon. As we talked, I found myself noticing things about Paul that I'd never paid attention to before. The way he really listened when I spoke, giving me his full attention instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. The way he laughed, not loud or demanding, but genuine and warm. The way his hands moved when he told a story, painting pictures. In the air, I realized that in all the years I'd known him, we'd never really had the chance to just be ourselves together. He'd always been Mark's friend first, and I'd always been Mark's wife. But here, in my kitchen, with the rain creating a little bubble of privacy around us, we were just Paul and Helen, two people discovering that they actually enjoyed each other's company. The conversation gradually became more personal. Paul asked me how I'd been doing lately, and there was something in his voice, a gentleness, a genuine concern that made me want to give him a real answer instead of the usual fine, thanks, I don't know, I said quietly, wrapping my hands around my warm mug. Some days I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, like my life is exactly what I wanted it to be. And then other days, I feel like I'm just going through the motions, like I'm sleepwalking through my own life. Paul nodded, and I could see understanding in his eyes. I know that feeling, he said, more than I'd like to admit. Actually, there was a pause then, not awkward or uncomfortable, but heavy with meaning. I found myself really looking at him, maybe for the first time in all the years I'd known him. His eyes were darker than I'd remembered, and there were lines around them that spoke of years of smiling and squinting into the sun and thinking deep thoughts. His gaze met mine and held it, and I felt something flutter in my chest, a feeling I hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't exactly attraction, though there was some of that. It was more like recognition, like seeing something familiar in an unexpected place. I looked away first, suddenly flustered, and pretended to be very interested in straightening the tablecloth. Do you ever wonder? Paul began carefully, his voice quiet. If we settle too easily? If we choose comfort and habit over, I don't know, over possibility? I looked up, caught off guard by the question and by the careful way he'd asked it. It was the kind of question that could mean many things, and I wasn't sure which meaning he intended. Sometimes, I said honestly, but I also think that life is mostly about making choices, some small and some big, and maybe some of what looks like settling is really just surviving, getting through the days and finding moments of happiness where you can. He was quiet for a long moment, considering my words. Then slowly, he reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. His skin was warm, and his touch was gentle, tentative, like he wasn't sure if it was welcome. I didn't pull away. I didn't move at all, actually. I just sat there, feeling the weight of his hand on mine, and looked at him, really looked at him for what felt like the first time. The rain had softened to a gentle patter against the windows, and the kitchen felt smaller, more intimate. The whole world seemed to have narrowed down to this moment. This table, this connection between two people who'd known each other for years but were just now really seeing each other. It wasn't romantic, exactly. It wasn't inappropriate either. It was just human, two people alone in a quiet house, carrying the weight of years and unspoken feelings, finally acknowledging that there was something there that had never been named or explored. And in that moment, with Paul's hand warm on mine and the rain creating a gentle soundtrack to our silence, I felt more awake than I had in months. With nothing but time between them, he withdrew his hand slowly, respectfully, and offered a small smile. Sorry. I didn't mean to cross a line. You didn't? I said, my voice almost a whisper. I just wasn't expecting. I know, he said. We finished Erdia in silence. The atmosphere, gentle or no, like something unspoken, had been acknowledged and set free. As he stood Toliev, he looked at me with a softness I hadn't seen in a long time. Thanks for tea and the company. Thanks for the scones, I said with a smile. And then he was gone, the door clicking softly behind him, leaving me standing there with the faint smell of almond and rain lingering in the air, and a heart that felt a little heavier, but also a little more awake. The next morning I woke earlier than usual. The bed felt too wide without Mark in it, though after 26 years off marriage, those stretches of solitude are into from. But this morning, it was different. My mind wasn't on Mark. It wasn't even on the long list of Iran seeds scribbled into my planner the night before. It was on Paul, on the unexpected invasion. The touch of his hand, the way his eyes had lingered just a second too long. I sat by the window with my coffee watching the sunrise. The color spread slowly over the horizon. Muted pinks, soft oranges, and the light cast a gentle glow over the backyard, where the trees still dripped from last night's rain. It should have been a peaceful moment, but my heart kept pulling me back into that kitchen. The warmth of his hand over mine, the words we hadn't said, but somehow still shared. Why did it stay with me? Was it because I missed being seen? Really seen Mark, and I had fallen into that silent rhythm of long marriages. The kind where love isn't gone, just quieter. He cared, had provided he checked in. But there hadn't been tenderness between us, and I don't know how long. Paul's visit had reminded me what it felt like to be noticed, to be heard, to feel something stir beneath the surface. Later that day, I was in the garage, digging through a box of old gardening tools. When my phone buzzed, I wiped the dust off my hands and glanced at the screen. Paul. My breath caught for a second. Just seeing his name lit up something inside me I wasn't proud of. It tapped the message open. Hey, Helen. I hope it's okay to text. Just wanted to say I enjoyed yesterday more than I expected to. You've always had a way of making people feel at ease. Hope you're having a good day. I stared at the message for a long time before replying. It's more than okay. I enjoyed it too. It was nice and comforting. Even thank you for stopping by. I hit send, heart thudding more than it should have. I told myself it was just a message, a simple exchange between two old friends, but deep down, I knew something had shifted. Something quiet and delicate, betrayal. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the way Paul had looked at me, like I mattered beyond the surface, like he wanted to know. The version of me didn't show most people anymore. It made me question things I hadn't let myself question in years. Not just about me marriage, but about who I'd become, what I'd settled into, what parts of me'd let fade. The next day was a Saturday, gray and cold. I busied myself with cleaning, anything to keep my hands moving while my thoughts spun in circles. Around noon, my phone rang again. It was Paul. I answered, trying to sound casual even though my stomach fluttered. Hey, he said, I know it's a little last minute, but there's this exhibit at the museum. Photographs from 60 seconds. You always liked that stuff, right? I did. Mark hated museums. I hadn't been in years. I was thinking, he continued, since Mark's still out of town and I'm flying out to Denver Monday, maybe you'd want to go. Just friends catching up. Not for sure. There was a moment of silence where I imagined the implications. Not just of going with him, but of what it meant to want to. I could have said no, I could have played it safe. But I said sure. That sounds nice. We met in the museum's parking lot an hour later. He was leaning against this car, arms crossed, a wool coat buttoned up to his neck. He smiled when saw me, a smile that reached his eyes, and I felt that quiet, impossible pull again inside. The museum was hushed and warm, filled with the smell of old paper and clean floors. We moved slowly through the exhibit, pausing at black and white images of protest marches, love-struck couples on park benches, gritty city streets frozen in time. We didn't say Mick, but we didn't have to. Every now and then he'd glance at me, not with expectation, but understanding. It felt like a strange dream to be standing next to someone who made me feel like I was still full of stories and secrets. Like I wasn't just someone's wife, or Semyona's mother, but a whole person again. Afterward, We walked to a nearby cave. We sat in a corner booth with chipped wood and mismatched mugs. Paul asked me about my writing I'd mentioned years ago that I used to journal, that he then wrote short stories in my 20s. Yes, no one else ever asked me about that anymore. You should still write, he sagently. Think you've got something to say? I looked at him for a long moment, so doy there was a pause, then quietly, Hazade, I used to think I'd end up with someone like you. The air between us shifted again, not heavier, but more fraggily. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to pull away from Thej. The other part wanted to step closer. I reached for my coffee, my fingers brushing against his. He didn't pull away. Neither did I. We stay like that for a moment, just a moment before I cleared my throat and said, it's getting late. He nodded. I'll walk you to your car. Outside the air was crisp and a few cherry blossoms were just beginning to open on the trees by the curb. Spring was coming slowly but surely. As I opened my door, Paul hesitated beside me. Thank you, he said, for today, for not making me feel like a fool. You're not, I whispered. You are not a fool, Paul. He leaned and then at a kiss, not quite his forehead, brushed mine, gentle, almost reverent. It was a touch filled with every word we hadn't said, every thought we were still afraid to give voice to. Then he stepped back, gave a small smile, and walked away. Sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine. My hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel, and all I could think was, something is waking up in me. Something I thought I had buried long ago. The days that followed were a strange mix of normal and not. Mark came back late Sunday evening, his flight delayed due to weather, was tired, distracted, carrying the usual souvenir mug from the airport gift shop and an unopened box of chocolates from the hotel lobby. I smiled, thanked him, and kissed his cheek the same way he always did. But something inside me had shifted, and I couldn't ignore it. I kept thinking about Paul, not just what Hazade, but how he looked at me, like I was more than just someone's wife. It was like a light had flickered on in a room he had forgotten was there. I wasn't looking for anything. I hadn't been unhappy actually, but Paul made me feel, remember, I'd seen like the woman I used to be before time softened my edges and the world told me to be smaller, quieter. On Tuesday, I found myself standing in front of my closet, staring at the old journals stacked neatly on the top shelf. I hadn't opened them in over a decade. I pulled one down, wiped the dust off the leather cover, and sat cross-legged on the floor of our bedroom. My handwriting was younger than Lapierre, more confident. I flipped through page after page of stories I had written in my late 30s, some finished, some abandoned halfway through, dreams, reflections, things I hadn't let myself feel in years. Mark had gone back to his usual rhythm, emails, conference calls, dinner at 7, falling asleep in front of the TV. We were still kind to each other, still shared laughs and little rituals, but we lived like roommates, familiar, dependable, and comfortable. Boot no longer curious, there was no harm, no betrayal, just quiet dectement. It was Thursday afternoon when Paul messaged again, just a simple question, are you free for coffee? Not for sure, just I could use some good company. I hesitated, I stared at the message, heart beating faster than I wanted to admit, and I typed, yes, same cave, we met that afternoon. He was already there when I arrived, reading something on his phone, his glasses perched low on his nose. When he looked up and saw me, he smiled like he was genuinely glad I came. We sat by the window this time, the light from the late afternoon sun casting golden shadows on the table. We talked about everything and nothing. I told him about finding my old journals, and he encouraged me again gently, without agenda, to start writing again. I think you've still got stories in you, he said. Real ones. I watched him as he spoke. He wasn't trying to impress me, he wasn't pushing for anything, he just cared. That kind of quiet tentativeness is rare, and it was what made what came next feel even more unexpected. He reached into his coat pocket and handed me a small, squarey envelope, no name, no writing, just soft ivory paper and a simple wax seal. What is this? I asked, confused. He smiled sheepishly. Just something I wrote for you, not romantic, not dramatic, just thoughts. I wasn't sure I'd even give it to you. I turned the envelope in my hands, uncertain. Do you want me to read it now? No, he said quickly. Later or not, it'll up to you. We sat in silence for a while, and then without warning he said, I think I've always admired you, Helen, not just as Mark's wife, but you, the way you listen, the way you see people. I looked down, flustered. You're saying that now, after all these years? I think I never had the right mint or the courage. His words hung in the air between us, delicate and dangerous. I'm not looking to make a trouble, Helen, he said softly. I would never want to hurt you or Mark. I just needed to say it once. I nodded slowly, unsure of how to answer. He didn't push, didn't reach across the table. He just sat there, steady and open, waiting when I got home. The envelope sat in my purse like a hidden ember. I didn't read it right away. I made dinner, folded laundry, laughed at one of Mark's dry jokes about airport food. But when the house went quiet and Mark was asleep upstairs, I tipped him to the kitchen, turned on the stove light, and carefully peeled the wax seal from the paper. It wasn't long, a page and a half, typed. Hugh wrote about the first time he met me, how he'd made everyone laugh at a backyard rebuke with some sarcastic story about our dog eating Mark's cufflinks. He wrote about how I always made people feel safe in conversation, how I had a way of real listening without making it about me. Hugh wrote about my laugh, how rare it was, but though genuine it sounded. And he wrote about how, over the years, he watched me quietly shrink into the background, while everyone else took up space. He ended with one line I read over and over again. I just wanted you to know. That's so mean and noticed that night. I sat at the kitchen table long after the letter was folded again, my hand resting over it like it was something alive. I didn't know what it felt. Hilt, maybe, but also a strange sort of peace, and a bit off a key. Because when someone sees you, not the version you present to the world, but quiet corners of who you really are, it's hard to go back to being invisible again. The next morning I woke before Thiessen and opened a fresh notebook, and for the first time in years he began to write. The following week unfolded in slow, gentle waves. Mark settled back into his routines. Coffee by 6. The morning paper folded just the way liked it. And those soft grunts Hamad when checking email on his table, like he was always slightly annoyed at the world, but didn't care enough to do anything about it. He was kind, still thoughtful in the ways he knew how to be, but I was beginning to understand that kindness alone couldn't reach the parts of me that had gone quiet for too long. The letter from Paul stayed tucked inside my journal, folded carefully between pages of words that hadn't seen light in years. I hadn't messaged him since. He hadn't either. Maybe he understood I needed space, or maybe he was giving me room to decide who I really was without interference. One afternoon, Mark came home early. We were in the kitchen, and he stood near the sink, rubbing the back of his neck like he always did when something was on his mind. You've been different lately, he said, not accusing, just observing. I looked up from the salad. I was prepping. Different how? Quieter, more thoughtful. And you've been writing again, haven't you? I paused, then nodded. Yeah, I have. His expression softened. I think that's good. You used to love it. I always thought you gave it up too easily. His words surprised me. I wasn't sure he'd even remembered that part of me. It felt like no one really noticed. I said carefully that I stopped. He was silent for a moment, then stepped closer and placed a hand on my shoulder. That isn't me. I should have noticed. I wanted to tell him that it wasn't just about noticing. It was about being seen, not just as a wife of the person who made the grocery lists and remembered birthdays, but as someone with layers still unfolding, someone with questions, longings, moments of doubt, and dreams still unclaimed. But I didn't say that yet. Instead, I smiled gently. It is okay. I think I stopped noticing myself for a while. Too, that night, as we lay in bed, he reached for my hand. It wasn't passion or urgency, it was comfort. And while it didn't answer all the things I was still trying to understand, it reminded me that relationships aren't always about fireworks. Sometimes they're about standing in the quiet together, even when you're not sure what comes next. The following weekend, I found myself driving through town alone. I ended up near the park Paul and Mark used to play softball in every summer. Back when we were a younger and time felt endless. I didn't plan to go there. It was muscle memory, maybe, or something deeper. I pulled into the gravel lot and parked under a sycamore tree. The branches were bare, but buds had started to appear, tiny and determined. I sat there for a few minutes, staring out at the empty field, and then I saw him. Paul was sitting on a bench near the far side of the path, a book in his lap. He hadn't seen me. He looked peaceful, unaware of how much he'd stirred me just by being kind. At there, it meant I didn't get out of the car. I just watched, my hands resting on the steering wheel, the same way they had that night after the museum. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't ashamed. It was just still. Maybe in another life with different choices, things would have been different. Maybe Paul would have been more than a soft memory and a folded letter and roar. But in this life he had learned something important. He didn't come into my life to take me away, he came to remind me of who I still was. Eventually, I started the engine, turned the car around and drove home. When I walked through the front door, Mark was in the living room flipping through the channels. He looked up and smiled. "Hey," he said. "You okay?" "Yeah," I replied, and for the first time in a long while I meant it. I think Ayami went upstairs, opened my journal, and wrote until the sun dipped below the horizon. Sometimes life doesn't give you answers. It gives you moments. Moments that stir something deep, and sleeping months that ask you to look at yourself and remember. And I remembered. I remembered the woman I used to be, and I started becoming her.